you've been here before, that these 2 weeks have been just packed with top-notch speakers. We have all been greatly enriched by the individual expertise that they bring, and that understanding of really the prism of religious liberty we keep adding to with each speaker, and it just magnifies itself. So I'm going to ask Veronica Jones if she would introduce our speaker this evening, and we'll get down to the work of...
Well, we've had top-notch speakers, but then tonight we have Jonathan Tobin, and wait till you hear his credentials. Jonathan Tobin, I have to say that Larry and I are especially happy to have him here, because we got to know his work through a particular website that we look at pretty much daily, and now he's introduced us to another website for which he is the senior online editor for Commentary magazine. And what a writer. And when we read this one article of his, just when the bishops had called in April for the Fortnight of Freedom, he wrote an article that just went right to our hearts. And something that we just have not seen any other place. And he talked about how this was not just an issue for Catholics and was trying to wake up other people. And for us, with me being a convert from Judaism, and knowing, and all of you folks, especially on the core team, knowing how hard we have been trying to get people of other religions and of various denominations to join us in our efforts, we just were so grateful. Well, now we'll start hearing about Jonathan Tobin. So I mentioned that he is senior online editor and chief political blogger of Commentary magazine, one to start reading, subscribe to, or subscribe and go on it online. It's America's premier monthly journal of opinion and ideas. In addition to writing the monthly commentary report on Jewish life and other feature articles for the magazine, Mr. Tobin edits and writes the publication's blog, Contentions, one of the most widely read and quoted political blogs in the nation. And when you read a few of these, you'll see why. In that capacity, he covers on a daily basis the U.S.-Israel relationship, Middle East diplomacy, as well as the American political scene. One more personal comment. Sometimes when we receive his blogs, I just wonder, how does he write so much? How do you write so much so quickly? I don't know how you do it. I just can't quite, I don't know how you do it. I'm not just saying that, I really mean it. Prior to coming to Commentary in January 2009, Mr. Tobin was editor-in-chief of the Jewish Exponent from 1998 to 2008. Under his editorship, the newspaper won over 120 awards for editorial and graphic excellence, solidifying its reputation as one of the leading Anglo-Jewish newspapers in the world. Mr. Tobin has won numerous awards for his own writing. Over the course of his career, he has been honored 50 times for commentary, editorial writing, and arts criticism. He has been named the top columnist and editorialist for Jewish newspapers several times, as well as the top weekly columnist and editorial writer in Pennsylvania. In 2006, he received the unique distinction of being named the top editorial columnist and best arts critic in Greater Philadelphia by the Society of Professional Journalists in a competition in which he was chosen over writers for secular and daily newspapers. Overall in his career, Mr. Tobin has been the recipient of 15 American Jewish Press Association Simon Rockower Awards, 11 Pennsylvania Spotlight Awards, 3 Pennsylvania Newspaper Association Keystone Awards, 13 Society of Professional Journalists Excellence in Journalism Awards, and 8 Philadelphia Press Association Media Awards. But did you ever get an award in Nebraska?
But it was counted.
Just, I rehearsed that one. In addition to appearing in commentary, Mr. Tobin's writing is published in the Weekly Standard, the New York Post, as well as in Jewish newspapers around the world. He has also served as a columnist for The Forward, Britain's Jewish Chronicle, and was the author of View from America column that appeared for many years in the Jerusalem Post. He has lectured on campuses and to Jewish and other faith-based organizations around the country, and has appeared on CNN, Fox News Channel, Fox Business Channel, the BBC, NPR, and numerous other media. Mr. Tobin was born in New York City, attended local schools, and studied history at Columbia. And so for my husband and me, and on behalf of the core team that's putting on this festival, we are absolutely delighted to welcome to you Jonathan Tobin.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. That was a very wonderful introduction. I think the notes on there that you were supposed to edit some of that. I think this is the point where you have to say the old joke about that. If my father were here, he would have loved it, and if my mother were here, she would believe it. But thank you. It's a great honor for me, a very personal honor for me here, to be invited to join you in your observation of the Fortnight for Freedom. And I feel very privileged, not only to be asked to speak, but to do so specifically as a non-Catholic who shares your faith in liberty and the necessity of speaking up to defend the rights of our nation's founders enshrined in the Constitution. Now, speaking as a Jew, you know, the traditional Jewish joke, one of the traditional Jewish jokes goes that a Jewish telegram reads like this: start worrying, details to follow. And I guess you're all getting a Jewish telegram right now, because you need to start worrying. And we don't know all the details of this fight, how it will play out, but I can tell you that you need to speak out. That's my beginning, and that will be my conclusion, but I want to lay that on the line right now, that this is about a community, about a people, about a nation rising up on an issue, informing people, and getting its point across persuasively. The message of the fortnight, as planned by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, is one that emphasizes, quite rightly, prayer and teaching, and that's very appropriate for a religious event. But it is not one, and let me emphasize this, speaking as a non-Catholic, whose message is limited to the Church's adherents, nor should it be. Religious liberty is not just our first freedom, enshrined as it is in the First Amendment to our Constitution, but it is a measure of our nation's respect for freedom everywhere, both here and abroad. Religious freedom is the canary in the coal mine. Wherever faith is restricted, wherever faith is persecuted, all freedom is in danger. Defending religious freedom is as important, just as important in 2012 as it was in the early years of our republic, when our system of government was just beginning to establish the principle that all faiths must be respected and not excluded from the public square. And indeed, let's remember, at the time that the First Amendment was passed, in many of the original states, Catholics and Jews were not enfranchised, did not have the right to worship in public everywhere in the United States. So we had to fight for our religious freedom. Religious minorities, it was not handed to us. It did not come in a blanket form. We had to fight for it. And that's why we have to take a lesson from that, because you do have to fight for what's important. I should state up front, and I'm sure all conversations this week, are going to at some point go back to the Supreme Court and to the argument that was resolved in a somewhat bizarre fashion. I'm not here to be the legal expert. We'll have a legal expert with us tomorrow morning. He's sitting right over there. And I'm I'm not here as the law professor or as the litigator. I will say, of course, had the court ruled against against the Affordable Care Act, our discussion might have gone in a slightly different direction. But a lot of the issues that face the church and face the question of religious liberty would not have been affected by that. You know, it didn't all hang on one case, and we shouldn't make that the beginning or the end, or even how that will be played out in the election that will follow. There are broader issues here. There are broader principles here than just the one case, and that's what I want to talk about as much as anything. I wanted this evening to discuss not just why the issues raised this year present a threat to our religious freedom, but also, as I said, to provide a slightly different perspective from another faith community. And my hope is not just to make an argument to you, which perhaps you've already heard many times before, about why this is all important, but to give you some idea, frankly, of why you've been getting so much resistance from your land. Why this is a battle rather than a procession, when I think most of us all assume, well, this is America. We all believe in religious freedom is observed. Why are we having such a discussion? Why is this a fight in the first place? And I hope, and both in my talk and I hope in our discussion after I finish speaking at you, that in our discussion together, we'll have a little better idea of why we're in the position that we're in and what we can do about it. Now, as to the main cause of contention, let us understand that it's inevitable and that it's going to be interpreted as a political struggle. And it is a political struggle, but it is not necessarily a partisan one. And I think that's important to establish that straight away. We should not approach it, as much as it's certainly true if someone's going to point out, well, will this be affected by the election in November? And the answer is, of course. Of course it will. But this is not just a battle of Democrats versus Republicans, as indeed some members of both parties are on both sides of this issue. Nevertheless, the passage of the President's signature health care bill has created a situation where the government has been able to interpret its power to ensure health insurance for all in such a manner as to intrude into the right of both individuals and especially religious groups to make decisions based on their own consciousness. It is not my role, nor am I interested necessarily in rehearsing all the intricate details of the dispute about Obamacare or about the HHS mandate. We'll touch on that. Again, I'm not here as the legal expert. I want to talk about something broader. Suffice it to say that so long as the government is determined to enforce its measures in such a way as to demand that church institutions accept federal dictates about paying for services that are opposed to Catholic doctrine, there is a conflict that must be resolved, and I believe one that should be resolved in favor of defending the church's constitutional rights. Now, why is the church in this position? Why do you folks feel embattled? Why did the bishops feel strongly enough about this that said we have to have a festival of freedom? We have to remind people of the core issues of this dispute rather than just going straight to that. Well, let's confront the facts on this, and it's not necessarily a pleasant one. The fact is, on some of these key social issues, the church and other Americans who share many of the church's principles on this, because the church is not alone on some of these core social issues, whether it is contraception or abortion or gay marriage. The church isn't alone on this. But the church is in a specific position as an institution. And those who share the church's beliefs have to understand that when it comes to the popular culture of this country, so the America that you see on TV, the America that you see in the movies, those of us who disagree on this are to a certain extent out of step, or at least can be perceived as being out of step by the arbiters of popular culture. One of the interesting things that has happened in the last generation or two is that there was a sea change against faith in American culture. If you look at most television shows, at most movies, just the zeitgeist of of our national conversation. Religion is itself out of the picture. And I try it sometimes, as I think many of us do, sometimes to relate to my own daughter, who's 11 years old, and to ask, well, the people in this show are making a decision. Are they making a decision? And, various dilemmas that characters get into on their arc along their way to resolution. Do they ever ask religious questions as to how their decisions are being made, about what they're going to do? Whatever life-changing, life-altering event is happening, and if you sit and watch, even the children, the after-school, the versions of the after-school specials, are they making religious decisions? As a Catholic, you may ask, are they making decisions based in any way on the religious principles that I hold to? I ask my child, are these people making decisions based on what we consider on the sacred principles of our religion, on the Torah, and on the teachings of Judaism, and on Jewish values, and indeed the broader Judeo-Christian culture of our country? Are they making the decisions? And inevitably, when we have this conversation, the answer is no. Most of the characters on the TV and in the movies live in a world where there is no God. They live in a world where there is no faith. Therefore, they do not ask religious questions. They may ask ethical questions, sometimes good ethical questions, but they do not ask them in a religious way. They don't we would say, are you making a Jewish decision as to what you're doing, how you're living your life? Is this in accordance with the Torah? Is this in accordance with what we consider right values? And the fact is, they're never asking those decisions, or rarely. And indeed, when we do see a show or a movie where religious questions are involved, where religious values are playing a specific role, it is generally only in one of those movies, such as the one that you were showing here as part of your freedom, which was specifically made by religious believers to try to counterbalance the overwhelming tide of the culture. A few years ago, and unfortunately not all of those movies are great. I remember a few years ago there was a wonderful idea for a movie, but not a very good movie, called Amazing Grace. I don't know if any of you remember it, about the struggle against slavery in England, which preceded our own struggle to outlaw the slave trade. And in fact, it was championed by William Wilberforce, a famous person in English history, who was a religious believer, in fact, an evangelical Christian. This is an amazing piece of history for Americans to understand, who, quite frankly, we're speaking of Catholics and of Jews. Evangelicals have to know that their faith played a very major role in one of the great moral struggles of modern history. And even they don't necessarily know. So we have this world, as I said, this universe without God, without faith. So how can we then be surprised when we turn around and our institutions say, wait a minute, you're proposing this political issue, this idea of national health care for all. Again, a separate debate for another evening, whether that's a good idea or not. Many of us here have strong views on that. But when aspects of that debate filter into the question of faith, and we say, no, well, whatever your idea about national health care, whether you think it's good or bad, there have to be limits, because we have to take into consideration our faith, or the faith of an important community in this country. It cannot be surprising when many Americans step back and say, are you kidding? Sort of like when Nancy Pelosi was asked whether Obamacare was constitutional, she just said, are you serious? Are you serious? In the end, she was proven right, but that's what many Americans, that's how many Americans, and I'm not talking about necessarily the editorial page editors of the New York Times, I'll get to them in a minute anyway, but it's not surprising when most Americans react to proclamations such as the ones the bishops issued in April with not so much revulsion as just surprise. The blank stare. How can how can we be surprised by it? Another part of that problem is the mockery of religion. Catholics have a specific problem. It's slightly different than the Jewish problem. And we Jews, we are very sensitive, and rightly so, I might add, about anti-Semitism. We actually live in a time, not in the United States, but in Europe and around the world, where there actually is a rising tide of anti-Semitism. So we take that very seriously. It's not a big issue. It's not as big an issue in the United States. But here in this country, mockery of Catholicism is it's standard fare. It's open season, and it has been open season on the Catholic Church for some time. Now, those who do so are within their First Amendment rights. We're beginning with the First Amendment. This isn't a country where we censor opinions because they are unpleasant or because they offend us. We live with them. And in fact, sometimes I think both Jews and Catholics, we should take a page out of our friends the Mormons book. Not their Book of Mormon. It's an interesting phrase. I didn't think I was going there. But the way the Mormons, who are probably now the subject of as much mockery as any American faith group, and their reaction to it is to never rise to debate. They just ignore it. I mean, whether it's on an HBO show, which was very popular, or the biggest hit on Broadway, which mocks their faith, 8 performances a week to capacity audiences and Tony Awards. The reaction of the Mormon Church is just to ignore it. Sometimes I think my friends of the Catholic League should learn from that and not take the bait and not argue about everything. And sometimes we're better off ignoring when people are trying to debate us. But the insults, when they are connected to the lack of faith, to, as I said, this universe without faith, they tend to delegitimize institutions. And that's part of the church's problem. It has been, to a large extent, delegitimized. The church has other problems as well. The church has been widely identified with internal scandals, and I'm not going to comment on that other than to note that every religious institution has had its share of scandals. The church's scandal is a pretty terrible one, and it's one for those who are responsible have to account. But like any group, we have a right, Catholics have a right, just as Jews have a right when people point out a wrongdoing within the Jewish community to say, so what? The fact that people did wrong doesn't mean that our faith is wrong. Doesn't mean that we don't have a right to speak up on behalf of our faith. And I think you have to attack that issue head on. And it's not, as again, these are not unrelated issues. These are not out of left field things. They are all part of the same thing. Now, let's go to the next question. Is the church being partisan? This is a major issue. We hear it a lot. Is it taking sides in a political battle? And I would answer, not strictly speaking. Some of the church's opponents, such as the New York Times, have argued that the government's attempt to compel the church to violate its principles was not a violation of its rights, and further claimed that a very inadequate compromise proposed by the White House should have silenced their concerns. I think this is an absurd distortion of the facts, but far worse is the way that these critics try to claim that Catholics are trying to impose their views on others. Quite the contrary. It is not the church, it is the government fiat that employees at Catholic institutions be provided with free contraceptions that is the imposition. The point here is not so much to advance the cause of women's health, which is the justification that advocates of the government's position make, but to demonize a faith group that has the temerity to stick up for its rights. Religious freedom is not just, as the Times put it, to the right to preach that contraception is sinful and rail against Mr. Obama for making it more readily available, though in fact the church is not seeking to curtail the availability of contraception to the general public. It is also the right not to have its institutions forced to either pay for or facilitate the receipt of services that run contrary to its principles. Now, this is an issue that we have to touch on a lot, but it bears repeating that one needn't share the Vatican's views on contraceptions to understand that a government dictate that would coerce churches to dispense it, it is a violation of their religious liberty. Now, the fact that as polls tell us, and you can believe polls or not, that even most Catholics support contraception does not mean the church and those who agree with it should be stripped of their rights. Just because you take a position that isn't necessarily popular doesn't mean that position can't be advocated. Doesn't mean that your religious rights can be abrogated because of your unpopularity, because you are being marginalized. Nor does the government's obligation to advance a compelling interest. Now, I was discussing with a legal expert over dinner, and the fact is, in 1971, the United States Supreme Court, the 4th Supreme Court, laid down what is known to lawyers as the Lemon Law about conflicts between the government and religious practices. And there was a three-part law, three-part rule, that if the government was going to impose something on it, it had to have a secular legislative purpose. It could neither be advancing nor inhibiting religion, and it must not entail excessive entanglement with religion. Now, quite frankly, I think on parts 2 and 3, the HHS mandate violates the Lemon Law, which is why I think the Beckett Fund and those who are protesting this have a good case. It also violates the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was passed in the 1990s by Congress, which specifically forbade the government from interfering with the religious rights of citizens, unless there was a compelling interest. So the church is on strong ground. It is not acting in a partisan manner in order to defend that right. Now that's something that I think has to be not only told to non-Catholics to help to stand with you, but I think it's kind of an internal Catholic debate to which I am something of an observer and a non-participant. But I think that has inhibited the willingness of many Catholics to speak out on this issue. It's because they're afraid that doing so just marks them as Republicans. Well, perhaps many of them are Republicans, perhaps many of them aren't. But when government intrudes on the rights of an institution, of a specific group, that group has the right to defend those rights. And if it happens to intrude into politics, well, so be it. That doesn't mean that the church is becoming a wing of the Republican Party, which it is not, because many of the issues, some very specifically of the issues that the church has raised as religious freedom issues, in fact, contradicts what many conservative Republicans are doing, especially on the issue of immigration. This isn't partisan. This is about principle. Now, the manifesto issued by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, I think it's an important document because, as I said, it's not partisan, nor is it, to its credit, an attempt to inflame sentiments on progressive issues. Rather, it was a sensible alarm issued to Catholics about the insidious manner that various government orders and legislation sought to abridge religious rights. It is inevitable that the lion's share of the attention was given to Obamacare. But there are other issues, and we'll touch on those. And though non-Catholics, as well as many Catholics, may not agree with Catholic beliefs, it's vital that they stand in solidarity. Now, one of the interesting aspects of the way this debate has worked is that the marginalization of the church's position, and I take that as a fact, maybe some of you will want to argue with me about it, but I think it is a fact. It turned on a series of quips by a very famous radio host. That until Rush Limbaugh said a nasty name about a Georgetown law student who was testifying to Congress about contraception coverage at Georgetown University, I think we were making a lot of headway about the issue of religious freedom. But with those remarks, which were foolish and were ill-advised, and for quite frankly, he deserved his share of opprobrium, the whole debate turned. And it turned into what we heard as the war on women. In other words, we stopped talking about religious freedom and we started talking about the victimization of women, the supposed victimization of women by the church and its supporters. And there's a lesson in this, partly, I think there's a lesson to all of us in advocacy about how what we say affects things and how we, civil manners. I'm often, especially at commentary, which I don't know how many of you are very familiar with us, but we like to think of ourselves as not merely advocates, but we're sort of the intellectual gold standard. We're long-form journalism. If you read Commentary Magazine, you don't get the short version. You don't get the USA Today version. You get a 4,000-word essay on the issues. I should add, it's not for specialized readers. It's intended for a general audience, but for an educated audience. But I often get emails from readers saying, why don't you just lay it on the line and sort of be as nasty as you want, and we always, well, that's not us. But there's a reason why it's not us, and why we think that we're right with these things, because sometimes these issues can really turn on ill-advised remarks, and why anybody in advocacy has to be careful. But the blather about what I consider a fictional war on women has distracted the nation from the fact that while no one is actually preventing anyone from obtaining birth control, having an abortion, or infringing on the rights of gays, these days the rights of Catholics not to support activities that contradict their faith is under siege. The issue, as the bishops rightly put it, is not so much whether Catholics are allowed to gather in their churches or pray as they like at home, but whether they and their institutions are to go on being permitted to participate in our national life. And I'm going to get to this more a little later, but that I think is really the key issue here. The principle at stake here is one which is clear that if the government gives itself the right to impose practices that contradict religious principles in this manner, it will fundamentally alter our freedom. So why isn't everyone rallying to the church's side? Well, I can't speak, I spoke of the general culture. Let me now step back and speak as a member of another faith community. And in part why I was asked here, why aren't Jews rallying to this issue? If there is any community in this country that ought to be sensitive to the rights of religious minorities, frankly, it ought to be Jews. Well, there are a few answers to that question, and you're not going to like all of it, and you'll understand some of it. But I want to lay this out there so that you do. Part of it is because this issue has been placed in a political context, and most Jews are both liberals and Democrats, and are big fans of President Obama. That's something that Commentary Magazine has been arguing against for a while, but it is a fact, and that even though President Obama is probably going to get a lot fewer Jewish votes than he did 4 years ago, he's still going to win a majority of them, which is astonishing to some of us, but it is a fact. Because even though when I was going to college a while ago, people were telling me, our professors were telling us that political affiliations and party loyalties was declining, that is in fact not true. At least not true everywhere. People still are loyal to their sides if they have a side in the political equation. Most Jews are loyal Democrats. And just as a lot of people on a lot of issues that don't affect them personally, they look to see what their party and their party leaders are saying, and then they make up their minds. Anybody who tells you different is not telling the truth. The fact is, where there is a partisan divide, people don't affiliate in the way that they used to. 60 years ago, people belonged to political clubs, and they joined things, and they participated in ways that they don't now. Today, everybody bowls alone, as the sociologists say. But they're still loyal to their parties. And to the extent that this issue has been framed as one of Obama versus Obama's opponents, those who like Obama, who share his views on other issues, are going to support him. So that's one point. But there's something a little deeper, and it goes to things that we can't necessarily affect now because it's about the history. Many Jews don't understand what the Catholic Church is today. because even though we live in a time when the Catholic Church is, quite frankly, as good a friend to the Jewish community as it has among any other faith group, most Jews are still living in the past when the Catholic Church was not a friend to the Jewish community. It's a plain fact. My grandmother, of blessed memory, who lived with me when I was a boy, grew up in a part of Poland that was, when she was a child, growing up before World War I, was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now it's part of Ukraine. But quite frankly, and she was one of the people that raised me, she was afraid of Catholics. She was afraid of her Catholic neighbors growing up. And not to put too fine a point on it, she had a reason to be afraid of them, because a Jew living in southeastern Poland had good reason to fear the surrounding non-Jewish community. And many Jews, even though we are so far removed from the world of the late 19th and the early 20th century, many Jews still believe that the reality that was a reality then is still the reality now. Now that's hard to believe, maybe for some of you here, but it's a fact. Historical memory is very strong, especially in a community like the Jewish community that views itself, not without reason, as to some extent endangered because of events in the last century, and indeed events even today, as I said, a rising tide of anti-Semitism. Educating people. Now, one of the things that I like to do when I speak to Jewish audiences, which I do more than I speak to Catholic audiences, is to speak about the changes in the church. Because one of the most heartening stories in interfaith relations in the last half century is the way that the Catholic Church changed the way it regarded Judaism and Jews. In the 47 years since the Second Vatican Council repudiated the ancient charge of deicide, the Church has moved not only from theological positions that reinforce the teaching of contempt for Jews, but to a position of active condemnation of anti-Semitism. That is a fact. It is a fact that I hope all of you know and are proud of. But it is also a fact that perhaps some of your Jewish neighbors or friends don't know as well. And it is something that we shouldn't be shy about talking about. And we don't hear enough about it. In particular, Popes John the 23rd, successor Pope Paul VI, John Paul II, were not only exponents of this change, but symbols of a new attitude of friendship with the Jewish people that culminated with the Vatican recognizing the state of Israel. And though there are still sources of tensions between our communities, we don't live in perfect amity about everything. There are still points of dispute. History is the bugaboo. The question of the wartime Pope, Pope Pius XII, is one that can get Jews and Catholics at each other's throats. Sadly, not that I want to hold that debate here tonight, nor do I think we need to. But there are points of dispute between our communities. But my point here is that that dispute is moot in a world full of active enemies, that any Jew that would still regard the contemporary church with the same suspicion that characterized the attitude of Jews in past generations is living in the past. And I think as Catholics, speaking to you as a Jew to Catholics, it is important for you to speak to the Jewish community that this is not the Catholic Church, this is not the Catholic community that my grandmother knew. And I don't think there is enough of that done. Now, this all feeds into the false notion. This is not just about, well, Jews and Catholics, interesting historical discussion. What does that mean? Because it feeds into the false notion here that the Catholic Church is trying to impose its values on others, when it's the other way around. There's something deeper going on here. And it is the real point, I think, the nub of the point. And that is the question of the place of religion in general, and not just of Catholicism. We live in an age where secularism is not just a choice, it is the primary motivation of much, as I said, of our culture. Over 60 years ago, a Jewish philosopher named Will Thorberg wrote a very important essay in a book called The Naked Public Square, about the way that our country was moving to a point where religion which was once the most natural expression in American politics and American public life, was being gradually excluded. And that we were not merely separating church from state, we were building so high a wall that we were excluding religion. And that this is the nub of the question. Lip service is the heat of religion, to freedom of religion. But if the church, to take a specific example, can be driven out of adoption services because of its stand on a social issue, sooner or later it can be driven out of any social service, or out of education, or out of public life at all. So can any faith group that does not conform to whatever may be emerging as the new social consensus about gay rights or about other issues such as contraception or abortion. What makes this especially difficult, and which I think a lot of the people within the church sometimes have been slow to understand, is that many of the Americans, those Americans who differ with the church on abortion or gays or contraception, are starting to believe that the goal in this political struggle is not so much toleration or acceptance for gays or preservation of abortion rights, abortion on demand, as it is to anathematize all those individuals or groups that disagree with them. That's what's going on. Thus, what is happening now is not just a growing acceptance of homosexuals and lesbians in mainstream society, a goal that many Americans, including many conservatives, think is not a bad idea, and many think it's right. But if, as I believe is now apparent, the goal has shifted from one of enshrining those rights to an effort to drive all those who disagree with it out of public life, if not polite society, then things have really changed. If even tacit acceptance of gay marriage for those who wish to avail themselves of it is not enough, by many who have misgivings, rather, if what is now required is active and open support, or even subsidization, even by those whose religious scruples, including Jews and other members of other faiths, which would forbid them from taking such a position, then we've come to a very different point in our political lives. If, as some on the left contend, that the precedent is the eradication of racial discriminations against African Americans, which I think is a specious and false analogy, then what will happen, and what is starting to happen, is that institutions like the church, which preaches love of gays and toleration for those who differ on other social issues, will be gradually reduced to the level of the Ku Klux Klan, a hate group whose views are entitled to neither respect nor any consideration by decent members of society. Now, is that an extreme or absurd scenario? Maybe. Let's hope so. But if, as the church knows all too well, we are already on the road to that point when Catholic institutions can't participate in adoptions because of their stances on gay unions. And that's why the kerfuffle over contraception was trumped up into a faux war on women. It wasn't enough to differ on the situation, to differ on that issue. It had to be that the church was portrayed as an enemy. Now, this church wasn't seeking to curtail the rights of Sandra Fluke, the young Georgetown University law student whose testimony complaining about that Catholic school's refusal to provide free contraception coverage, or any woman to contraceptions, or any other service through which its doctrine doesn't approve. But what the church's opponents are seeking to do is to force it to not merely acquiesce to things it forbids, but to actively support. The analogy here, and I think it was a very good one, which I've tried to put forward to Jewish audiences, and it was made by Bishop William Laurie, a Connecticut Catholic bishop, is that if there were a government edict that declared that kosher restaurants should make ham sandwiches available to its patrons, or even more to the point, to its employees. And just as the so-called compromise proposed by President Obama, allowing the church to pretend that it was not paying for contraception that was provided to its place, there could be another compromise. Bishop Laurie said that the fact that many Jews eat pork, many of them do, does not undermine the right of kosher restaurants to exclude it from the menu, nor should it obligate kosher institutions to provide ham or shrimp or cheeseburgers to their non-Jewish employees for lunch, rather than their refusal to do so being a case of observant Jews imposing their beliefs on others. A law that sought to enforce such restaurants to alter their fare to conform with a government diktat that would allow the state to use its power of coercion to run roughshod over the religious beliefs of its citizens. Laurie went even further, and I think humorously but aptly, and he analogized the president's compromise on contraception by saying that it was no different that if the state allowed the kosher delis to not put pork on its menu and to have its employees serve ham sandwiches, but still forced those restaurants to allow pork distributors to set up kiosks on the premises where free ham sandwiches could be served, the cost for which would be borne actually by the kosher deli owners. That's the deal that the church was on. Now, if this analogy sounds ludicrous, which it does, that's only because there is no national meal plan to feed Americans in the way that Obamacare has nationalized health insurance. But as Bishop Laurie pointed out, there isn't any more need for anyone who works at a Catholic institution to get birth control from the church than there is for a pork-craving customer or employee to get ham from a kosher deli. In both cases, there is nothing preventing either person from working someplace else or going down the block to get the item they want someplace else. The attack on the church demonstrates not only the contempt of this administration for religious freedom, but the threat that its signature health care bill poses to constitutional liberty for all Americans. The impulse to impose these regulations on the church has no more to do with the correctness of the Vatican's ruling on contraception than the validity of kashrut, which are things that people of faith can disagree about. Both are religious beliefs that must be respected if we are serious about protecting religious freedom in this country. Such freedom exists for all or for none. Now, I'd like to make a small detour, a quick detour away from this issue to talk about something that is seemingly tangential, but which I think is actually quite material to the question of religious freedom in this country. And that is our attitude to religious persecution abroad. I think it is to the bishops' credit that they have sought to highlight this issue in this context, because it is not unprovoked. The fact is, the reaction of Americans to the issue of persecution, forget about religious persecution in general, let's just talk about the persecution of Christians, the majority religion in this country, so they tell me. The fact is, most Americans don't give a hen. Persecution, I can tell you, when my wife, who was a lawyer, is working on a case about a person who is struggling not to be deported back to Indonesia. She's a Catholic. And has a reasonable fear of persecution because of the way, the rise of Muslim intolerance for Catholics in Indonesia. She's almost certain to lose the case, but that's another issue. But what is more troubling to me than whether she loses the case or not is the fact that Americans just don't really care about this issue. This is something that goes on all over the world. There's religious persecution in China, which is, all we hear about China is that it's our biggest trade partner and that they manipulate the currency. We don't care much about the fact that there is widespread discrimination and indeed persecution of Christians, and that the Laogai, a term that most Americans don't even know, but which they ought to know as well as the word gulag, because Laogai is the Chinese gulag, that Christians are there in great numbers. Those who don't, especially Catholics, who were willing to still be loyal to Rome and to the Universal Catholic Church rather than to the state communist Catholic Church. This is an issue that Americans are indifferent to. Plain fact, we don't hear much about it. Even those of us who write about it, institutions like the Ethics and Policy Center, which wave the flag, and the State Department has issues a report on religious persecution every year, and it's a very valuable document, and nobody reads it. And a few journalists comment on it, like me, goes in, and then on to the next thing. I don't think this is unrelated to our problem about religious liberty at home. I think our indifference to the principle of religious freedom, wherever it happens, is something that has deadened our senses as people, as a nation, the question of religious liberty. Our willingness to ignore, if not to acquiesce to persecution, speaks to our contempt for religious rights. It's a sad commentary on this country, but this is not an issue that seems to grab the imaginations of most Americans. Let's also understand, now let's understand that how we react to this situation, we can bemoan, but let me wind this up by saying, okay, so what are you going to do about it? Okay, so some people give speeches, some people write articles. What are you, the citizens, the people? How do you do something with it? Well, the answer is very simple. You speak out. You don't let the culture silence you. You don't let the fear of partisanship make you quiet. You speak out in conscience. You speak to your neighbors. Now, as with any political cause, you can easily throw up your hands and say, well, what am I going to do? How can I can't fight the media, I can't fight the Congress, I can't fight the Supreme Court. Is there, what hope for me, an ordinary citizen? Well, let me tell you something. We can bemoan our liberties, but this is still a democracy. And people do listen. And a passionate, committed, informed, civil, aroused movement can make itself heard in this country. One that has not merely the chutzpah to speak out, but the confidence that it is speaking for the right, that it is speaking up for what is right. Let me make an analogy to you, and it goes back to my own youth. An issue maybe that was tangential to some of you, maybe some of you thought it was important in the day, and that was something that really formed me as a political thinker, and that was the movement when I was a student for freedom for Soviet Jewry, for the right of Jews living under the evil empire to exit that atheist tyranny. When I was first a student, it was not a very popular cause. But within 20 years, there were 250,000 people gathered on the Mall in Washington, with virtually every member of Congress with us. And we won. We won not just because the Soviet Union fell, although that was felicitous, but because we were able to persuade the rest of the American people that we were right, and that this was an issue of supreme moral importance, and one that galvanized not just the imaginations of Jews, who have reason to care about it, but of non-Jews as well. And it was one that was an argument based on morality. It was an argument based on basic principles of what makes us Americans. That's why it was popular. That's why in the end, why in the beginning it was just a lot of malcontents and students waving signs of the Soviet consulate in New York, being ignored by the establishment, and in the end, it was the establishment's issue. Now, I can't guarantee you that you'll have the same happy ending, but I can tell you that the methods and the principles that work towards that success ought to inspire anyone who speaks up on an issue of moral concern. And it ought to remind you that though you are in the minority, though you feel marginalized, if you have right on your side, if you speak from a position, as I say, of moral authority, of identifying with the founding principles of this country, you will find an audience. You will not just find an audience, but you will find sympathy and support throughout this land. I believe that, as we say in Jewish liturgy, with perfect faith. If there is anything that I believe in, that my whole experience, my whole adult life, my student life as an activist, and my adult life as a journalist, it has been that I believe that the conscience of the American people can always be pricked on behalf of moral issues. You are not alone. Well, it may seem like you're alone right now. But you don't have to be alone. And that the more that you speak out, the more that you gather, and it doesn't matter whether you're gathering in small groups or in great groups, because if you start small, you can get big. But you have to be convinced of your own moral purpose. You have to have the confidence and the willingness to be a troublemaker, to not let yourself be intimidated, and to speak up. And you'll be heard. You'll have many defeats, but in the end, you will win. Because I believe that in America, right does in the end prevail. Maybe that makes me a cockeyed optimist, but I believe it will. Our duty is to speak out. Our duty is also to work together, to rise above our differences and to maximize our points of agreement. Doing so will not just enable freedom to be preserved, but make our country morally stronger. If we do, and I don't doubt that we will, with God's help, we will prevail. Thank you. We all need to stretch after that long. I would look forward to your questions, and I hope we can have a bit of a dialogue on this, related. So, please, sir.
You made a comment midway where you remarked about a remark that Rush Limbaugh said. And you said that remark changed the conversation. I think his remark unveiled a conversation that was previously brought forth early in the year during the debates when Stephanopoulos posed the question to Romney concerning contraception. The Republicans are against contraception. Can you talk about that? And he looked at him dumbfounded. This is what the press does. I believe this was a narrative.
Speaking as a member of the press.
I think this was a narrative that was set in place with a time expectancy to be brought out into the open. And I think it was one that was trying to change the issue from abortion to contraception. I don't know if this was the plan prior to that was unveiled in August when they initially mentioned the HHS mandate. I think that this administration and the press are hand in hand with what is going to be the national conversation. And we have these little packets that move along in time, some a couple of weeks, some a couple of months. The Zimmerman issue in Florida, I think, was a very good example of that. That lay in limbo for 3, 4, 5 weeks. It had actually happened. But they waited for a previous issue to leave the table. That was the next one.
Well,
What can you say about what you've seen and who you talked to concerning the press actually controlling the thought process that we as Americans work through?
well, I would I would start by saying the press can't control our thoughts. The press can, or that elements of the press can certainly direct the conversation in the direction that they are interested in talking about. Now, if you, was there a plan? There was no cabal of journalists, of liberal journalists, or even of participating in a listserv. There was no memo that was passed around. This was something that the left and the sort of mainstream media liberals were interested in changing the conversation. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. They were interested in changing the conversation because at that point, before the Rush Limbaugh comment, the conversation was not going in a direction that they liked. And so many in the media seized on that point. Now, unfortunately, you know, we have to give the devil its due here. Rush gave them, you know, he fed them red meat. You know, he did something egregious, and it happens in political debates all the time. Sometimes it can work in your favor, sometimes it works against you, and I'm trying to speak objectively about how the media operates. If something outrageous happens, and that can define the issue. And that can define the issue to the liking of conservatives, and sometimes it can define the issue to the liking of liberals. But either way, sometimes one outstanding event can just sort of puff out. You mentioned the Trayvon, you know, the Zimmerman, you know, the murder case in Florida, and that just, it seizes the popular imagination. And I have to tell you, many in the press themselves, even, you know, the big shots of the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, they can't always predict what those issues are. I mean, if they could, they'd all be making a lot more money, and their publications would be doing a lot better than they are. They are sometimes these things just pop up. Sometimes we don't know what Americans are going to just get obsessed with, other than, you know, the British royalty. That always works.
Let me just say one other thing. At the same time that this comment that Limbaugh made that changed the narrative, there was a similar, more egregious comment made by a commentator on the left. It was far, far worse. I think it was against Sarah Palin or her daughter.
Yeah, but he actually says stuff like that all the time.
But that never became a narrative. If the situation were reversed, it would have been bold type for months and months and months.
You know,
I just subscribe to the fact that they do control what we talk about. They don't control the events so much.
well, I mean, I think this is an important point, and it's not, you're not way off in left field or right field here. You're touching on something that, you know, when I talk to conservatives or to even Republican politicians, you know, and we sort of have these kinds of conversations, I said, oh, so you've discovered that life isn't fair. Yeah, you're right, life isn't fair. Conservatives do not get an even break in the mainstream liberal media. That's why it's the mainstream liberal media. You know, the problem with the CNNs and the New York Timeses and the NPRs and all that is not that they're biased, which they are, is that they don't own up to their bias. If we were having a discussion tonight about media bias, this is what we'd be spending the whole night talking about. Yes, in the mainstream media, local media, conservatives don't always get an even break. That doesn't, you know, okay, but that doesn't mean that they have to give up the game. That doesn't mean that they can't win. Ronald Reagan, you know, I write this, and sometimes they even say it to conservatives. The media didn't give Ronald Reagan an even break either. Guess who got the last laugh? You know, so that doesn't determine the outcome. And some liberal members of the press, speaking off the record to me as a colleague, will admit it, yeah, sure, so we're biased, but that doesn't mean that we're going to win. And they don't always win. But in their own forum, you know, the playing field isn't even. It's tilted towards one of the goal lines. And this is not an original discovery. And I don't mean that to sort of poke fun at what you're saying, because you're absolutely right. But on a certain level, those of us who are engaged in advocacy have to say, so what? Okay, so we work around it. We find other ways to win. Yes, sir.
Could I pick up on that a little bit? I totally agree with your point that we're moving towards a secular society, and that there's a great deal of indifference out there. Those are powerful points. But part of that indifference, I think, is being overcome by what is a biased media. Have you seen Media Research Center data put out by Brent Bozell, for example?
Sure.
He has endless examples, highly credentialed, of media bias, which sort of smothers the general populace. He points out that the bias in the overall media is really smothering opinion in the United States.
Okay, but, okay.
I just asked, what do you
Okay,
think?
that's, you see, these are fair points, but there's a response to this.
Sure.
And we shouldn't be so, there's a reason why you shouldn't be too obsessed with this, and that is, if this were, if I were speaking to a group of liberals, or if I were a liberal speaking to liberals, what they are talking about is the fact that there are this isn't 1990 or 1980, where there are 3 networks, and, a couple of big newspapers and all this, and that's just it. The market is an amazing thing. That's the reason why conservatives, why we're right, because the free market is an amazing thing. Yes, the mainstream media is liberal, it's biased, it's uniform, but they don't dominate it anymore. Look on your television, whether you have cable or DirecTV, there are hundreds of channels now. They're not just 3, middle-aged guys telling you what the news is every night.
The fairness
It's
doctrine.
24/7.
How about the fairness doctrine that they keep
Well,
kicking out?
if they-
Where
if
does
they-
it
well,
ugly
the
head?
fairness doctrine is a threat to freedom of the press, never mind freedom of religion. That's why there are alternative media, that's why there's talk radio, Rush Limbaugh. That's why there are conservative magazines, there's National Review, there's Weekly Standard, there's even commentary. So you're not alone. I think this is part of our discussion tomorrow morning when we're talking about the media. One of the things that is troubling about our country is not just that there's a mainstream liberal media that's biased, it's that we are almost 2 sets of, the country is bifurcated in the way that they read and listen and watch the news. You tend to be either, you either read the New York Times and listen to NPR, or you watch Fox and read the Wall Street Journal. And never the twain shall meet. And I can tell you that as a person who believes in the debate and who believes in this whole process, that's not necessarily a good thing for either side. That's why liberals tend to live in a liberal echo chamber and are just act, when you're confronted with conservative ideas, act like you're speaking Swahili to them. Sometimes it's a little bit, and I have to tell you, speaking to an audience that is rightly complaining about liberal bias, there are other outlets. And the fact is, as that liberal journalist said to me, we don't win all the elections. Well, there's a reason.
One final question for
Sure.
me. Would you draw any parallels between what's happening in the United States now versus what happened in Germany in the early 30s?
There's a standard rule in journalism, and indeed in civil debate now, and that is the first person who mentions the Nazis.
I didn't mention the Nazis.
It's a Germany in 1930s. Okay, this is advocacy 101. The first person who mentions Germany in the 1930s loses. And let me say this: it's not because there aren't lessons to be learned from Germany in the 1930s. It's because the result of what happened in Germany in the 1930s was so drastically different from anything that's going to happen here, because this is a democracy, and this isn't Germany in the 1930s, that invariably you are setting up an invidious comparison that is, in the end, is going to fall short. It's just, in Latin they say reductio, in debating, in Latin you say reductio ad absurdum, to take it to the point of the absurd. Don't go. There are enough arguments to be made. Hopefully I made a couple of them here tonight, and I certainly didn't fill in the list. Let's not use those epithets or even step up to that, because then we are in the realm of demonizing and in delegitimizing. President Obama is somebody with whom I don't agree on a lot of issues. If we were just talking about foreign policy, which is part of my brief, as my introduction said, I could spend the whole night talking about everything that he's done wrong in foreign policy. Actually, most Americans don't seem to be caring much about foreign policy this year, but leave that aside. I don't have any grief for President Obama. I think he's a lousy president. Not telling you how to vote, but I disagree with a lot of stuff that he's done. But he's not Hitler. He's not Stalin. He's not Mussolini. He's not a fascist. He's not a communist. Some of his ideas sort of tiptoe up to socialism. But
Like most of them.
But that's, we can have a debate, we can have a civil debate And I'm not saying your analogy was uncivil. I'm saying that once you start stepping into that goo,
Wasn't Hitler elected?
he won some elections, but in the end he was appointed by Hindenburg. And he was able to manipulate, a very shaky German democracy. We are not the Weimar Republic. The American Republic, I'll wave the flag. We're going to lower the flag at 8:30, but let me wave the flag. I have great faith in American democracy and the American people. As a journalist, and as one who writes about a lot of rough, mean, terrible stuff, and I write about issues that are of great concern, and it's not always, sometimes it's all doom and gloom. But I'm a pessimist, what does this mean? It means I'm a pessimist in the short term, but I'm an optimist in the long term. I have great faith in this country. This is the greatest country. Our liberties, our Constitution, our people, our political culture, which encourages not extremism, it penalizes extremism. It makes it hard to change the Constitution. That's the genius of our founders. I have great faith in this country. Let's not talk about Germany in the 1930s. The Weimar Republic was a sad, it was a train wreck. Our country isn't a train wreck. It has problems. It has foolish leaders at times. But let's have faith. I ended on that optimistic note about how I believe with God's help we're going to win. We can prevail on this issue just as we prevailed on other issues of great moral purpose. That's because this Constitution, because this republic is so great, that I have that faith. And that's why we don't have to go there. We can win on other terms. Yes, sir.
I'll try to stay on the other side of that very fine line that
Okay.
set in the sand. You mentioned that Obama not been successful, that he's made foolish moves. There is a number of people within the press and of political thinking that feel that he hasn't been incompetent, he hasn't been foolish, and he's on a planned schedule, and it's all premeditated. And if you look at the socialist European countries, are we heading in that direction because of his incompetence, or are we on a straight track heading for that direction with a lot of smoke coming out of the engine so you don't notice it?
Okay,
We're going into the 30s.
Okay, well, then I think what you're alluding to is something very different from this Weimar Republic stuff. And that is the fact that President Obama, the sort of mindset, the frame of reference, if you will, where he starts, seems to be one that looks to the European social democracy model, of countries where the government provides everything for people, and where, Greece, all these failed European countries, where, Italy, where there is, lack of incentive, no growth, and countries sort of dead in the water, and where faith is dying as well. But then again, that's a whole other issue. And where hate is popping up as well, which I think is these things dovetail. I think he does see that that's part of what Obamacare is heading towards. You can make the argument for Obamacare and this whole sort of social democracy point of view, which those who advocate it don't see it from that point of view. They see it as a matter of social justice. I would argue that it's not, but that is an argument, as we say in Judaism, that for the sake of heaven, one where reasonable people can disagree. I think he wants to head in that direction because that's what he's comfortable with. That's what he believes. Those of us who oppose it and who look to a free market, capitalism, have a very different frame of reference about what is the ideal for America. And I think that is where this discussion is rightly placed. These are very different visions for this country. And I'll go so far as to say that you can be on the other side of the issue from me and still be a patriotic American who believes in democracy. I just think you're wrong, and I think the president is wrong on these issues, and I think the direction he would take us in is wrong, and I think there are consequences from that mistake. And yes, of course, there are members of the media that think he's right, that think he's not failed. I'd go further than that. I mean, this is a president, this is something I've written about, this is a president who, because of the historic nature of his presidency, because we can't get around that, he is a historic figure. It doesn't matter if everything he did was wrong and everything he did was failed, and if he only is one term, he's still somebody for the history books. This is not Rutherford B. Hayes. Because he will always be the first African-American president, and that is an important and in many ways, very righteous thing. And that, because of that, he gets treatment in the press, which is different from any president since Jack Kennedy. I call this, he gets the Camelot treatment. No president since John Kennedy was assassinated has had his family treated with the sort of respect and sort of godlike awe. And my 11-year-old daughter points out to me every time she sees Michelle Obama on a kid channel. You never saw Mrs. Bush there. The playing field is not even for him. That's one of his tremendous, speaking as a political commentator, that is one of his tremendous edges going into this election, because he operates, with that advantage. That doesn't mean he's going to win, and it doesn't mean, okay, so there's media bias. So what? That doesn't mean he's going to win, but it means he has an advantage. And you want to follow up on it?
Yes, as an extension of that question, then, you're admitting that he is somewhat a Democrat, but an extremely left Democrat?
You just discovered that.
Yeah.
Yeah. The question
He's a liberal. He's the most liberal president we've had since Jimmy Carter. Perhaps the most liberal since, I don't know, fill in the blank.
My question to you then is, will the Jewish Democratic favor, do most of the Jewish voters then favor the extreme left side of the Democratic Party? Are we actually dealing with two Democratic parties now? The old Democratic Party that wasn't way left, and what appears to be an extremely left party.
That's
So
a very
it's
interesting question.
It's almost like we have three parties at least. We have
Well,
left Democrats, we have the regular old staunch Democrats, and does the Jewish community favor the European socialistic,
some do.
democratic?
Listen, the question of how the Jews are going to vote is something that we at Commentary pay a lot of attention to, for obvious reasons, and something that we, the whole discussion, the question of liberalism, and conservatism within the Jewish community, it's a whole long, to say, as we say, on one foot, to answer on one foot is the expression the Jewish liturgy says. The fact is, he's going to get a majority of the Jewish vote no matter what he does. Now, he is not going to do as well as he did 4 years ago. 4 years ago, he got about 78% of the Jewish vote, which is astonishing. Jews were second only to the African Americans in terms of their loyalty to the Democratic Party and in the way they voted for Obama. He's going to do much worse with the Jews this time around. Now, that still means he's likely to still get around 60% of the vote, maybe a little more, maybe a little less.
Well, that's fine in New York, because that doesn't count, excuse me. New York's automatically in his corner,
Well,
but Florida,
but
on the other
Florida
hand.
and Pennsylvania,
There you go.
that change, that drop, he may lose as much of a quarter of the Jewish votes that he got last time. And he's going to lose a lot of those votes because of his attitude towards Israel. We haven't talked about that tonight because that's not what you asked me here to talk about, but I could gladly talk to you about it, and I've written a great deal about it. That because he is really the most hostile American president to our ally Israel that we've had since Jimmy Carter. A lot of Jews have drawn conclusions about that. Now, many Jews have, he spent 3 years basically fighting with Israel, undermining Israel, tilting the diplomatic playing field towards the Palestinians, undermining Israel, and to no good, because the Palestinians had no interest in making peace, so it went nowhere. But, and then in the last 6 months to 9 months, he's been on a charm offensive, a re-election charm offensive, which has, which may be enough to reassure some partisan Democrats who are Jews who care about Israel. fact is, not all Jewish voters vote, they're not single-issue voters any more than you are a single-issue voter. Many, quite frankly, unfortunately, many American Jews don't really, don't think Israel is an important issue or its survival is an important issue. But, he's going to lose a lot of Jewish Democrats, quite frankly, who are concerned about the way he behaved. So, that's the thing about democracy. It brings accountability, a measure of accountability. And that's why democracy wins. It doesn't work always exactly the way we want it to. It doesn't give us the result that we want it to. But it's not a spectator sport. Can't emphasize that enough. Democracy is not like baseball. It's not like watching the Yankees on TV or whatever team you happen to root for. You have to go out there and play yourself. That's the only way you win. You're not guaranteed to win, but you are guaranteed to lose if you don't try. And I think that's as much as I'm going to be able to do.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I just want to point out to everybody that before we go out for the flag ceremony, that Jonathan is someone with deep faith in God. And when he suggested before that we rally the courage to speak up, he's talking from experience. Again, Larry and I would suggest to you that you read some of his articles and understand that he is someone who is speaking from the vantage point of having courage and knowing that he has had to and needed to, from inside, speak out. There are not a lot of people in his demographic, I'm not sure how to put it, but there aren't a lot of people like Jonathan that are speaking out as he is. He is a brave person, but he knows that this is what he has to do. He's been experiencing it, and that is from where he is encouraging all of us to do the same. So thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.